Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the books that I've read this week, and as you can tell they are lots of little ones. Again, partly just because my brain has not this is a recurring theme. I should probably just stop complaining about it and actually just sort it out, but I think I've slept a bit weirdly, and so short books have been the key to my concentration recently, but they've been really fun, so let's talk a little bit about them here. First up, a really cute little book by 404 Inklings, and they've sort of published these little tiny books as well that have sort of basically almost like mini essays on things. And this is Love That Journey for Me by Emily Garside, which is the queer revolution of Schitt's Creek. So the TV show Schitt's Creek, it basically focuses in on queer representation within the show, basically, and so it talks a little bit about the kind of the more obvious parts, so you know, the relationship at the heart of this book, the heart of the show, between David and Patrick. It talks a little bit about some other things that happen throughout as well, so in terms of characters appearing and their sexuality really not being a big deal to many other people, or kind of, you know, it talks about a scene where David gets really ready to be kind of nervous about going to this place because he kind of assumes that this drinks kind of like barbecue thing is going to be a bit scary as a queer person, and actually everyone's fine with him being queer. They just don't like that he doesn't really drink beer, and actually the whole show actually has kind of created this sort of queer utopia almost, where people are just sort of generally respected and liked regardless, and it's normally judgments from outside that come in the form of the family that actually are the points of contention. And so it's just a really beautiful little book, just a really fun teeny tiny little book that kind of reminded me of just how much I loved Schitt's Creek, which I hadn't really watched at all until lockdown. And then I just binge watched all seasons in one go and wept several times. And it's a great show. But anyway, this is a really cute little book for people who are fans of that show. Next up, I read 4 books by the same author, by Anthony Anaxagorou. Part of the reason for that is I went to a book event for Anthony, talking about his book Heritage Aesthetics, his new poetry collection. And while I was there, I was like, wow, this also sounds really interesting. I don't really know anything more about him. Let's see what other books my library has. And then proceeded to get the other 3 from the library. And he is just such an interesting author, I think. So Heritage Aesthetics, I'm going to sort of take them all together, but they are obviously all different. Heritage Aesthetics talks a lot about him as a man from, you know, his family's from Cyprus. He lives in London, was born and raised in London, and so for him, he has this sort of thing of Cypriot identity being quite a complicated one, and he sort of mentioned this in the talk as well, about how there's this constant balance between you know, people sort of saying, well, you know, are you Greek Cypriot or are you Turkish Cypriot, and kind of having to divide the island and sort of divide your experiences by what language you speak and what part of the island you're from. And he kind of talks about it being a lot more complicated than that. And so heritage aesthetics, which I apparently cannot say today, deals a lot with the political concepts of nationhood, of statehood, about where you're from, what language you speak. There are some really gripping poems in this about some really tough political things within the UK, so he doesn't really shy away from difficult topics at all, but I think it's really rewarding for that, because there are just so many of these great poems that really investigate things around state violence and around what it's like to have a sort of divided identity, to be read by some people, in his case, as being white British, and read by others as being a foreigner, and this weird, complicated sort of thing about who he is. And in many ways that's carried over a lot in some of his other collections. So in After the Formalities, another poetry collection by him, which was earlier, he also talks about some of these same issues. So this book probably, I think, wrangles a bit more with some of that political side in some more specific ways. So whereas I think Whereas I think Heritage Aesthetics probably talks a lot more about politics as it sort of pertains to Europe and Cyprus and various other things. I think After the Formalities looks a lot at state violence. It really is very class conscious. It really interrogates a lot of ideas around class, around who people are, and I thought was really interesting for that. And I think these two collections alone really, I think, show that he's so interested in those topics, which also we then see a little bit in The Blink That Killed the Eye, a collection of his short stories. And I thought this was interesting for many other ways as well, because there are sort of bits that are lingering a bit maybe in the background of those two poetry collections that come up a lot more, a little bit more front and center perhaps in this book, and is a little bit more around notions of masculinity and fatherhood and various other things. So in Heritage Aesthetics he talks about being a father, and in The Blink That Killed the Eye he sort of, I think, although these are, you know, in theory fictional, there are sort of quite a few bits that seem to come up, you know, recurring themes that he explores a lot in his poetry when talking a bit more about his own personal life, particularly around his father and his uncle, and the sort of the world of men, almost, in many ways, of what it's like being in a, you know, in a sort of family structure, which occasionally is, you know, where there are certain activities that are just with men, and there's a real sort of macho or machismo thing that's sort of permeating it, but also a class consciousness and a political consciousness and all of these things interacting. And so these short stories are really quite interesting, I think, for that. Yeah. And then separately, which I mentioned in a video just recently, the other day, was around his sort of thoughts on writing. So How to Write It is just him talking about how to be a writer, how to find your voice, and in many ways again sort of ties up some of the biographical information of his life around his uncle, around his father, and sort of how he navigates things around his identity. So I think taken as a sort of collection of four, it was really interesting to me to basically delve into the life of this man separately, you know, and just sort of learn a little bit more about him. I'd really say I think Heritage Aesthetics feels like a really strong place to start, just in terms of you know, having a poetry collection that really taps into who he is and his identity. So I think it's really interesting for that. Next up, I read Turtle Diary by Russell Hoban, and I read this for a book club, and I'd never heard of this book or the author at all before this, and yeah, this was an experience. I actually did really end up enjoying this. I have no idea really what went on, and actually as I was emerging from the book club, I probably could do with a reread, but actually what I did read, I absolutely, you know, what I did read it, but what I did take from it, I absolutely loved. So yeah, this book is wild. Essentially, at the heart of it are two people who are Neep and, is he called William? I keep on missing, sorry, Nera and William. I don't know why, because Neep is something else she says later. Anyway, so they are these two characters who are in many ways quite awkward, quite shy, don't really know how to engage with the rest of the world, and in many ways have both sort of given up on life in many ways. And they both have this sort of joint project essentially to go and release some turtles and do these other things. But in many ways this book is just wild. There is almost not a single normal sentence in this book in a really positive way. Like I genuinely found myself laughing quite a few times. There's a scene that I'd forgotten that somebody, well, a line that I'd forgotten that somebody reminded me of in the book club, which was that at one point there's a bird that is described as looking like a civil servant, which is just like such a wonderfully zany thing. But like, I mean, for example, here's a passage that shows you just how much line by line this book can change. Haven't smoked for 3 days. Busy night and day not smoking. Already I can climb stairs better, but that's not much of a life. With smoking, one has a life while dying. How did the Greeks ever run a whole culture without it? Maybe that's why there was so much homosexuality. The turtles are no substitute for smoking. I'm tired of playing with pebbles and sucking wine gums. Breathing straight air seems an empty exercise. I may kill somebody if I don't smoke. Mr. Sanders' life is hanging by a thread, if he only knew it. Like, that's wild. It's just sort of this lurching thing from smoking to stairs, and then the Greeks and homosexuality to then murder, and all of it's thematically connected. It is connected to him smoking and going through the motions of it, but it's just wild. And so I really want to reread it. It's only a little book, just under 200 pages. And from the conversations that were coming up in the book club, it appears that he is an author who has been fairly prolific, and many other people have loved his other books. So I'm really keen to reread this at some point, with a little bit more headspace, taking it a little bit more slowly, because it seems to be quite a profound book. And particularly a few people in the book club said, I should just bring them on, shouldn't I, at this rate? But a few people from that book club said, you know, it's a book that when you read in your 30s, you kind of enjoy but don't fully get. And then you read it again in your 50s and you realise just how profound it is. And I mean, you know, I mean, I'm 33 going on about 87, so maybe maybe in a few years I'll reread it. But yeah, there were some really profound, beautiful moments in this, alongside some absolutely balmy, bizarre things going on. And so, as much as I normally tend to get rid of my books after I finish reading them, either giving them away or selling them or whatever, and lots of mine are from the library as well, this feels like a book that I'm going to hang on to, and I kind of want to come back to in a few years as well. And last but not least, two other books I read that deal with very different sides of queer life, essentially, particularly gay male life. The first being Don't Fall in Love, Sam, by Sam Morris. And I remember seeing this book sort of on Instagram. He's quite an interesting figure, and it's essentially a set of sort of musings and thoughts of him going through parts of his life, and particularly looking at former lovers and what that sort of spelt in terms of his self-esteem, in terms of his identity, in terms of sort of his mental health, in terms of various other things. And he's really quite candid in this. He talks about essentially being quite close to breakdown at various times, and you know, sort of some quite abusive and difficult relationships, but he also talks about these really quite profound and quite beautiful relationships at the same time. And so it's just really quite an interesting book. It's sort of interspersed with bits of poetry or sort of other thoughts. And although that didn't necessarily always hang together and fully work for me, in the sense that I think I kind of wanted him to linger a little bit longer on some of those stories, I still think there's a lot of real beauty in this book. You know, if my main criticism is basically I wanted him to spend longer on things, that's probably a good sign, right? You know, that there are a lot of really quite beautiful stories, I think, going on in here. So yeah, really, really interesting little book. And the final one being Bad Gays by Hugh Limmey and Ben Miller. And this is a book I've been meaning to read for quite a while, and I kind of knew that it was a book that I'd probably wait until I got an audiobook version of it, eventually through Libby, just because I kind of felt that I'd listened to bits of the podcast, and I think I kind of wanted in that format as well to kind of hear it. And essentially, as the title suggests, and if you're familiar with the podcast, it looks at LGBTQ people from history, and particularly those who were not the best in doing various things in history. So not necessarily bad at being gay or what have you, but these are LGBTQ people who have caused harm or have been damaging in various ways. And it's almost in some ways a kind of corollary, sounds really ridiculous as a word to use here, but kind of like a response almost to kind of a lot of LGBT History Month things that talk about it as if you know, queer people have only ever been these wonderful beacons of light, whereas anybody who knows anybody knows that that is not true of anybody in humanity. You know, that there are obviously always sort of bad actors within things as well. And so he talks about, for example, people who were LGBTQ but also kind of caused a lot of harm through empire or cause a lot of harm in other ways. It's a touchy topic to kind of do that, right? To focus on characters and not have this book come off as if it's trying to make a point about that. In many ways, this book is more about delving into history and looking at some of those nuances, actually, that sometimes it's someone's shame around their sexuality that maybe makes them act a little bit more of a certain way. Obviously not excusing that behavior, but it maybe goes some way to starting to explain what had happened or describing it a bit more fully. A really interesting book. And I think what's kind of quite fun about this is you know, a lot of historical books, I think, have traditionally, you know, had the at least had the impression that they are quite, you know, they're quite dry, they're quite serious, and there's something quite fun about listening to a story that's quite, you know, very very serious, and we're talking about some quite dark things, and then there's just an aside from the authors being like, ugh, such a thirsty twink, and you're like, hang on, sorry, what? And it's so funny for that as well. So I think if I'm right, it was just chosen as the history book winner from the Goodreads Awards. I have my own thoughts and feelings about the Goodreads Awards, but regardless, really nice that so many people have read and loved this book this year. And I think that takes us to all the books I've read this week. Again, quite a lot of short ones, quite a lot of really nice, fun little books. But it's been a real pleasure to read all of these. And I'm still within Indie-cember. A few of these were kind of indie-ish ones that I've been meaning to read for a little bit. And the next couple of weeks are probably going to be a bit a bit heavier on the indie side. How do I phrase that? You know what I mean? As I'm just sort of really focusing on this is a bit of indie plus what's left from the library recently. So there we go. Anyway, I've been Pod the Bookerer. This has been really quite rambly. Lovely speaking to you all, and I will be back soon. And we're about to go into Christmas, which also means lots of end of year lists coming as well, which is going to be very, very exciting. Speak to you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.